Sequoian. Steve Hassan talks about the cult persona, which is the obedient, conformist persona built on top of the true persona of the member individual. It is the cult persona which enables the person to commit destructive actions toward oneself or others in a way he or she normally would not, in the name of God, planetary salvation, or whatever is indoctrinated. I'm very curious about your take on and your own struggles with this cult persona. How did you retake control? What happened to it after that? Did it just disappear, or can you ever still sense it? Because I assume it was such a strong force in your life for a long time. I'm asking because some ex-members, such as Marty Rathman, seem to have remained in an inner conflict/limbo between past and present selves. All right, thank you very much for this question. I'm glad to give my own ideas and insights about this. Specifically, I don't really think of this cult persona thing as a separate personality. The way you describe it in the question here gives me the impression of an almost like a schizophrenic kind of separate, personality, split personality thing. And that's not really how I see it. It's a little more complicated, unfortunately, especially for second-generation cult members, people who were raised under the roof of a very high-control authoritarian group dynamic situation. With very, very strict rules and guidelines, and they never really had a chance to develop anything else except that persona. And what's that about? Well, it's an interesting thing. So what we really are talking about when we're talking about a cult persona, at least as far as I'm concerned, is we're talking about a value set or a belief set, which includes not just some ideas or some beliefs, but an acculturation, a set of social values, manners, etiquette, rules, guidelines, ways you act, ways you don't, things you can say, things you can't, things you can think, things you can't. All of this is, acculturation, is a set of values that we all have. We've all got various acculturations, various sets of personalities, you could say. You can frame it that way, but it's really just this set of values that we carry around with us that we apply under certain circumstances. And when you're in a high control group or an authoritarian totalist group, these words are used because we're trying to get across the idea that they are very overwhelming and overbearing on a person's psyche. And they affect every part of how the person thinks or acts or looks at the world. And in fact, it even impinges on or affects their ability to perceive the world objectively. There's a filtering process that occurs with a lot of these values where inputs of sight and sound and smell and whatnot end up going through these filters of what is and isn't acceptable, what is and isn't good, what is and isn't bad, right? And this is all part of this package. So it's kind of really sort of framing a whole set of ideas and morals and these kind of things and worldviews and beliefs into a package which we would call a persona or personality. But it's really just a matter of kind of semantics and convenience that we use wording like that. It's not like your brain or your mind is divided up this way. It's a lot more complicated and nuanced up here. So that all kind of being said, in other words, it's kind of complicated. We try to simplify this by making the analogy of it's like a different personality. And so using or extending that analogy, for myself, coming out of Scientology really means coming out of a cultural mind space, a cultural space where the Scientology culture has that bubble world that we talk about, has all these separate values and ideas. And this whole us versus them is kind of what sets the boundaries or the borders of this bubble world. We're us and they're them outside of this boundary that we've set up. And so the personality is when you come out of that bubble world, when you stop living in that culture, the cult. I'm using the word culture on purpose here, right? Because cult and culture are very, very connected ideas. A cult is, in a way, a cult is just a very extreme or very focused culture. It's very small, it's tiny compared to the larger culture in which it exists, which generally has wider, broader values and beliefs and more accepting and more tolerant ideas and beliefs than the little tiny subculture or cult that we go on and on about. Okay, so when you come out of that, you're in this bigger, broader culture. And so now all those values, ethics, morals, beliefs, and ideas, and the language, and the thought patterns, and the action patterns that you've engaged in, the rituals, the rites, the practices, all of that stuff now changes because you're in this whole different milieu. You're in this whole different world. And the culture's different. So you have to now change and acclimate to this new situation. All of us experience this. Every time we move, we experience a reacculturation of some kind. You're in a new environment, new setting. When we get a new job, we experience this kind of thing. So you can stretch that persona analogy to this too. And you could say, well, in one job at McDonald's, you have a McDonald's persona. And when you leave McDonald's and you go work over at Burger King, well, you're going to have the Burger King persona and you're going to have to adopt that. And that's going to have a slightly different values. There will be commonalities, but there's also going to be differences. And we harp on those differences and complain and talk about them all the time. So that's kind of how this works. As far as me retaking control, first it was learning about all this. It was about figuring out, that this was something that is part of my upbringing, part of my life experience, was that I was acculturated to a very extreme belief set and totally bought into it, right? And viewed the world through that lens. So once I knew that that's what had happened, reading Hassan specifically with Combating Cult Mind Control, reading, Singer and Lalich and various other authors with Cults in Our Midst and other works, you learn about the process of what happened. And you go, oh, okay, yeah, persona, got it. And then you go, okay, well, if that's the case, then I can start subscribing to different value sets and different ideas, and I don't have to keep carrying around these ideas and these action patterns of how I should behave. I can start shedding some of that. So the very first step of taking control or retaking control is first learning that there is something you have to take control over, and that there is something there that affected you in a very deep way, and you need to figure out what the anatomy of that is. What happened to it after that? Did it just disappear? Can you still sense it? Well, this is what we talk about when I mention, the language, for example, or some of the ideas that the language represents. The PTSdness, right? Every time somebody is sick in Scientology, you assume the person is a potential trouble source. And there must be some suppressive person or suppressive element in restimulation in their environment. And if you've been watching me for long enough that all that just makes sense, yeah, okay. That's straight Scientology. So if you believe that, if you subscribe to that, then of course every time there's an accident or illness or injury, you're going to be looking around for the SP. And it took me quite a few years to sort of stop thinking that way. But first, acknowledging that I was thinking that way, that was an ingrained habit that I'd had, and that I needed to actively sort of push back against it when it cropped up. Oh, yeah, Scientology. Okay, good. Well, that's not actually true, and I don't have to think like that. And after you do that enough times, and it's active, you have to really practice it. It's not a passive thing. When these culty ideas or cultic language or action patterns come up, you have to actually be self-aware enough to go, oh, right, yeah, okay, that's the cult talking. That's not me. Right? It's an old habit, and you have to actively undo those habits by learning new ones. kind of how we work. So, so you adopt new ways of thinking or new ideas to take over the place of the old ones, and you learn to stop using the Scientology language because it's really not helpful to understand how things really work. The Scientology language locks you into these thought patterns and these action patterns. So by, sort of consciously working to undo that language and not use it, you overcome the cult persona, if you see what I mean with all this. So that's kind of how it works, and that's been my experience with it. And I stressed there the need to consciously work on this because it does take learning and it does take work. It's not something that just happens to you over time, naturally or organically. In fact, if you don't do something about the habits that you have, whether they're cultic thought patterns or smoking or drinking or whatever it is, you know that if you don't do something conscientious about it, that you're going to continue acting that way, or you're going to continue thinking that way or saying the same things over and over again. So it takes that conscientious work. And I stress this because you mentioned, people like Marty Rathbun, who are people who are not interested in doing that work, who pretend to do that work or think they're doing that work, but really are reinforcing some of the cult stuff. It's hard. This isn't easy to do. And it's not like any of us are naturally inclined to figure it out. There's a lot of people, especially with Scientology beliefs, who think psychiatry and psychology are full of shit, have nothing to offer, who have very weird ideas about spirituality, who have some, coming out of Scientology, you're going to have some pretty goofy ideas about science, about religion, about tradition, about Buddhism. You're going to have all kinds of crazy ideas about Buddhism. And a lot of other things. And so if you don't work to overcome that, you might think, oh, well, yeah, I don't use the Scientology language anymore, so I'm all good. And it's like, well, no, there's a little bit more to it than that. I mean, that's a good thing. I'm definitely saying, it's not like, that's not nothing. But there's more to it than that. And I don't think, in my passing knowledge of Marty Rathbun as a person, it doesn't appear to me that he's really done that work. And so he and other people who come out of these situations still cling very, very strongly to some of those cultic ideas. And unfortunately, a lot of those ideas are based on just false premises or are just totally wrong. They are arbitrary ideas from L. Ron Hubbard, and they're not really, very true. So people can continue to get into all kinds of trouble trying to make those things make sense and make them true, and that's where you get trouble. So that's that. I don't know. That's pretty much all I can say about that.